Hello, everybody. Thanks again for tuning in and listening to another episode of Muzzle Punch. I really appreciate all the feedback so far from the first 4 episodes. I really appreciate the support and the listenership. Today's September 11th. I sat down with my father last night because my father is the only person that I know currently still living and have a personal relationship with who was alive for both the events that occurred for Pearl Harbor and then later on in his life for 9/11. My father served in the military for a short time, and he is a pretty deep thinker. So it struck me as a great opportunity to sit down with a man whom not only do I love him because he is my father and he raised me, but I also have a profound respect for him and his intellect and the way that it works. And it was a heavy influence on my life. So I had originally planned to sit down with another friend who has a great story to tell, and she will be on at a later date. And then I was going to sit down with, as a backup, another friend who, unfortunately, hopefully our paths will cross again in the not too distant future, and I'll be able to sit down and have a conversation with him. But as events unfolded, that was unable to happen. So I was down 2 guests looking to get this 5th episode knocked out. And it struck me to sit down with my father. I called him. Actually, I swung by there. They weren't home. And then I called him Friday night, and he agreed to do it. And then he came down last night, and we sat down and had this wonderful discussion. It's pretty winding and long, but I believe it's extremely interesting. And for me, it was fantastic. Insanely enlightening on so many levels. I find my father to be fascinating in the way he thinks, and even after all these years, he still continues to surprise me with some of the things that he believes and some of the conclusions that he's reached over the span of his life. I hope you all enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Please, please, please enjoy this wonderful interview with my father, William Ralph.
Break it down like this.
No problem. All units stand by. 70 receiving a 34 with a weapon. 1549 East 18th Street. 1549 East 28th.
All right. So now we're live. And the reason, an important reason that I wanted to sit down and have a discussion with you and to have you on, Pop, was it occurred to me that there are fewer and fewer people, and there are few that I know, who were alive both for Pearl Harbor and for 9/11. And these are 2 events in American history that are often drawn in parallel to one another as far as their significance and the impact that they had on the American psyche. And I've studied American history quite extensively. And so I know from reading and watching documentaries what Pearl Harbor was like. But I am curious for you, and you were 4? 4 or 5? 5. No, 4. You were 4 years old at Pearl Harbor, correct?
I was 3.5 about.
3.5 about.
I was
okay.
born in March of 38. It happened in December of 41. Yeah, about 3.5.
3.5.
Yeah.
Do you have recollection of it?
I have no recognition of the moment that it happened, say within the day or two. But what happened about, I think we had rolled into 42, but very early in 42, and I remember hearing and understanding that my father had been called up by the Army I don't think it was in the nature of a draft as perhaps enlisted men might have put up with. But basically, he had communication skills in Europe, in Spain, and in the United States because he was a junior to slightly more than junior executive at what was then International Telephone and Telegraph Company. And they were then just a communications company, not the conglomerate they are today. Mm-hmm. He was one of, I think my mother said, the founder and 12 boys, referring to his initial group of young executives, started IT&T. And Pop was one of those 12 boys.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize he was called up that early in 42. For some reason, it never occurred to me that he was actually called up that early.
Well, the thing to consider is this. As you're well aware, the military has to plan ahead even when it does not know what the future holds, but they've got to be ready to step into places where they expect to go at some time in the future. And one of the things my father had was a command, or at least a commanding knowledge, of the communications, which were all telephone largely in that time, in Europe.
Because he had been in Spain, correct?
He'd been in Spain, but he had to know what was going on in France, what was going on in Germany, because these Spaniards had to be able to communicate with the rest of Europe.
I got you. So he was knowledgeable of the entire communication network on the continent at the time.
Yeah, because IT&T was specifically an overseas phone company. They were not a domestic phone company. There was no hope of that. But they made their mark outside the borders of the United States, down in South America, where they essentially, I believe, brought the telephone and its networks to South America. And he had a great command of Spanish. He was as fluent in Spanish as most people are in English who are native speakers.
Oh, okay.
But at the same time, he also knew Spain because he'd been there even before the beginning of the Spanish Revolution. So he knew the communications systems. He was helping set them up in Spain and, of course, communicating with the rest of Europe.
Okay.
So what happened was the Army needed specialists. I'm sure they called AT&T. I know they called IT&T, and they said, well, we got Marty Ralph.
Oh, okay.
I believe that's the process.
Yep.
Anyway, I'm a little kid. It's in the evening, and my daddy is suddenly going to be in the Army.
And you were at this time, you were living in New York City, correct?
Negative.
Oh.
We were in Virginia at the time because he was in the Washington, D.C. office at that time.
Okay.
And what happened was, all of a sudden, my older brothers tell me that Pop is going in the Army. He went in as a major, and he eventually became a full colonel, which is usually called in the slang a bird colonel, and picked himself up all sorts of awards at the end of the war. He got the Croix de Guerre from Belgium. He got the Croix de Guerre from France. He got a Bronze Star from the United States. He got a Legion of Merit from the United States. But basically, he was not a combat officer, but he was a very, very good administrative officer, a staff officer. I guess that's the word I'm looking for. He was high on Eisenhower's staff, and he replaced, well, let's put it this way. Early in the war, Eisenhower had a naval captain who was also a reservist who got pulled in, who knew Eisenhower very well. They're personal friends, and he was, for a while, doing the job that my father was doing, as well as being Ike's personal assistant.
Okay.
With a full set of colonel's wings, except they were captain's wings on his shoulders.
Yep.
So he was pulled in to replace that part of Mr. Butcher's duties, Captain Butcher's duties. And he's mentioned in the book, my 3 years with Eisenhower, as a real professional coming in to take over one of Captain Butcher's duties.
Okay.
He disappears after that, but he did very, very well.
So do you remember when in 42 he actually left after being called up?
I remember only that night that I found out he was going to be in the military, And the next thing I know is just my mother, my brothers, and myself, and the family dog.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it.
Was that Maud?
No, that was a little Cocker Spaniel blend. I won't call her a mutt, although that's the technical term.
Okay.
She was a little Cocker Spaniel blend, female, who had puppies under the back porch later on in her career. But essentially, all I can remember then is a couple of his returns from the military on leave during the course of the war. And
how many times did he come home?
My memory is defective, but I think it was twice.
Twice.
I believe it was
3
twice.
Years?
Yeah, because he served
just shy?
deep into 45.
Okay.
Beyond VE Day and maybe
so he was there for some of the
Day.
Yeah, he was there for the occupation, the beginning of the occupation.
Oh, yes, very much so,
Okay.
because one of his tasks was to do what they called denazify Germany. It's sort of like the loyalty oaths Confederates had to take after the Civil War, that they would now adhere to the Constitution of the United States and not attempt to overthrow it again or secede.
Yeah.
And the Germans had to be denazified, and I don't know how successful it was in process, but eventually most Germans realized that what had happened during Hitler's time was a terrible mistake, and that was not the way to go in the future. And one of the things we had learned in the United States, one thing we learned from Lincoln was to not oppress the defeated half of the combatants on the losing side, but rather to treat them as human beings. So there was the Marshall Plan and things like that to help revive Europe. And
something we failed to do after World War I.
Yes,
some would argue. A lot would argue. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that.
And I would suggest that was what gave rise to Hitler, the desperation, the Weimar Republic. And they were wise enough to learn from Lincoln and see that treating your opponent in a very definitely victorious but respectful manner was more successful in terms of keeping that area pacified for the future. And I hope it will continue. It came as far as the European Union. I hope it will let the European Union still survive, because Europe has survived since the borders went down in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Did you guys stay in Virginia the whole time?
Yes, and we stayed in Virginia through the entirety of the war. We were near Washington, D.C. Alexandria then was a very small town, not what it is today.
Oh, okay.
And we were on a road that radiated out of it, but nearby was, I don't even know, Fort Belvoir is still there.
It is still there.
Okay,
Yep.
But they used to train artillery there, so you would hear the rumbling of the guns in the atmosphere day and night from Fort Belvoir, even in what we called Alexandria, even though we were way on the outskirts.
Okay.
And tanks would go by on Franconia Road, which was the name of the road we were on. It hadn't been developed because the war interrupted commercial housing development in that area and froze it till well after the war.
Okay.
Because the war effort was far more important than commercial real estate development at that time.
Yeah. Different America.
Yeah.
When did you move back to New York?
It was sometime in 46 after my father actually got out of the Army. And I remember reading a news clipping from a paper in Alexandria that my father had been awarded the Bronze Star, and it was datelined Alexandria. In other words, it was after the war was over, they figured he'd done a good enough job to earn a Bronze Star.
Oh, okay.
Now, there are, for those who are not aware of it, there's two ways to earn a Bronze Star. One is being very, very capable as a staff officer, or other administrative position, but to the ultimate. The other is to be very brave in a combat situation. Now, I need to point out that my father got a Bronze Star because he was a very capable administrator and a staff officer. You picked up 2 Bronze Stars, one of which was for taking care of a motor pool, but the other one was for being brave. Okay, you saved the government $2 million in your stay in Iraq. That may not seem much to you, but that's money still, and that can be noticed eventually, and it got you a Bronze Star. So you got Bronze Star for both those reasons. A, you were brave the first time in Afghanistan. B, you were smart in Iraq. And as a taxpayer, I thank you for that second one as well as for the first one. But the thing is, my father's Bronze Star was for skill as an administrator, as a communicator, and that's why he got his 2 Croix de Guerre, one from France, one from Belgium, because he was on Eisenhower's staff, and everybody got that pair of Croix de Guerre, but it was at the basic level. It was not for courage. It was for being very good staff officers.
I actually want to back up a little bit because, all right, he went to and graduated from Princeton, correct?
Yes, my understanding is he graduated with an engineering degree and a minor in Spanish because he wanted to be a traveler.
Okay, so he translated his engineering degree into a communication type profession. How did he end up at ITT?
Okay, first of all, they wanted to telephonize the world outside the United States because what was then Bell Telephone had the United States locked up. Biggest market on the planet for a long time.
Thank you, Alexander Graham Bell.
Yes. However, there was a big market outside the States waiting, and for whatever reason, the colonel who owned the company saw it. South America and Spain seemed the easiest ones because I guess nobody else thought of telephoning them in the sense of setting up a telephone network. Britain, Germany, France, they had plenty of go-getters, but Spain was not technically advanced in the way that the more northern countries were.
Yeah, it was kind of a backwater. Along with Italy, actually. Not quite as much as Italy, though. Although Italy was less so, but still not a primary power.
Yeah,
at the time.
Yeah, they were still the Germans' baby brother in the horrors of World War II. But the thing is, Spanish-speaking countries looked to be a fertile field, and that's what the colonel did. He sent his troops to South America because that's where Pop started.
Oh, he did start in South America.
Mexico, South America, Central America, and I can remember seeing come on.
No, I mean, I'm just saying, South America at that time was still, it was a pioneer. I mean, it was
indeed.
It was very similar to Africa at the time. It was a very dark interior.
Yes,
meaning as far as unexplored even at that time.
And I'm sure what they did was the way a lot of things happened. They went first to the cities and then to the outlying areas. Because my father sent my mother a postcard with a picture of one of the outlying areas in Mexico and saying something very grumpy that I can't remember. No cuss words, but essentially he was not happy being there because it was essentially riddled with mosquitoes and bed bugs and stuff like that. And he was not happy to be there, but he was the engineer who... I'm sorry, say again?
Was this before Pete was born?
I suspect so, yes.
So what...
Pete was born in Argentina in 1933.
Okay, but
Tony was born in Argentina in 1936.
Oh, I didn't know they were both born in Argentina.
Yes, they were capable of dual citizenship, except even then Argentina was very dictatorially run country. Perón was in charge. I don't know much about it. And he was as much a dictator then as anybody is now.
Wow. Grandpa Ralph really kind of lived in the golden age of dictators. I mean, he moved through the world into countries that were...
I'm sorry to say it, but the golden age of dictators is far from over.
Well, sure, but no, it's not the same as it was then. I mean, you had... It's just... I never realized. I mean, some of the big heavyweights
Yeah,
among
the
dictators
strong
of the
men.
world. Yeah.
Yeah, the strong men of the time, and I'm putting that strong men in quotes, were very much in charge. You didn't think about civil rights or anything like that for those poor people. They were stuck with whoever they had.
Yeah.
And Pop learned that. I remember one time somebody brought up the subject of Portugal, and he said, you better watch out. That is a very, very tough country to operate in.
Wow.
Because the Portuguese were, again, they didn't have Franco. They had somebody else who was functioning as a strong man. And the cops, well, let's put it this way. If there was a dispute between you and a cop, you didn't have a hope in heaven of getting what would be considered a fair trial. Here, the cop was one automatically. If he whacked you with your nightstick, you were as good as done.
Yeah, that's pretty strong. That's a pretty strong statement from someone who saw Perón and Franco. So to say Portugal was a tough place, that's saying something.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry. So okay, graduated Princeton engineering
29
with his sub-Spanish. Okay,
29. Yeah.
And then he was working for ITT by what, 30?
I don't even know.
Was that because of the Ivy League connections that he got hired?
It's possible, but also he had the mix of resume that IT&T needed. They needed somebody who could speak Spanish, although I'm sure he hadn't acquired the full fluency he had later on. And he was an engineer. And if you know what an ohm and a volt and a watt are, you're way ahead of anybody you're going to go string telephone lines for. The telephone was already a fairly advanced piece of technical equipment, and they could, how shall I say, poach people from Bell to help with this kind of thing. You know, you want to work for IT&T, we'll make it worth your while, bring what you know of telephones here, it'll pay off.
And they were a U.S.-based corporation, right? So they were kind of
IT&T, oh yes,
so they were
very
kind of
much
like one
so.
of the first multinationals. Or at least within that kind of sector, that
it was
subsector, that sector of the market.
At Pop's time there, it was a phone company, and it was not the conglomerate that it is today. That's basically it.
But they were a true multinational, meaning that they were headquartered in the U.S., but they're doing most of their business overseas.
Oh, yes, definitely, yeah.
With a lot of relationships in a lot of other countries.
Yeah, and Bell had this country locked up.
Yeah.
That's, in a way, all its descendants still have this country locked up.
Yeah.
Verizon is its biggest baby, as far as I know. But what I know about telephone business is far, far less than maybe most people know.
Well, I even remember growing up as a kid. I mean, Uncle Larry worked for Bell.
Yes, he did.
So I remember the Bell trucks. I remember when Bell was at its kind of, it was regional though. It was like New England Bell or whatever.
Right.
And then they had Southern Bell. They had fractured.
Yes, they were fractured, I think, by the Supreme Court because they were very clearly a monopoly of the most powerful sort. I mean, right from making the phones to selling the phones or renting the phones and.
Yeah.
And the lines were all theirs. And they fought like demons, as far as I know, to prevent anybody from using those lines for other purposes unless they paid a very serious premium.
Yeah.
In which case, sure, come ahead and use my lines.
Yeah.
Stick them up, and you're welcome.
So he ends up – okay, so that's the kind of trajectory. I never really knew what the timeline was of when he graduated. I didn't know that both Uncle Tony and Uncle Pete both were born in Argentina.
Yeah.
33, 36. Okay.
Right.
All right. And then you get to New York in 46 or back to New York because you were born there.
I was born in New York in 38.
Yeah. And he had just left Spain.
Oh, no. What happened was once I was a little boy, and I'm a real little boy, I would say toddler age, he had to go back to Spain, and we all went with him.
Oh, okay.
And that would put us somewhere around 39. When the Spanish Revolution got very serious, we, Mom, and we three boys were shipped home.
Okay.
And Pop stayed behind for a while, and Mom found a place to live in Riverhead, which is on the far eastern end of Long Island. And we didn't live in the city at that point, or in the boroughs. We lived way at the other end of Long Island, and Pop was working in Spain. And when he came home. I forget quite how he made it home. I presume he didn't fly home because that was still a very exclusive way to travel. Probably came home by boat. I guess Mom met him at the boat, and he said, "Where are we living now?" And I guess she told him Riverhead, and then eventually we moved back. No, that was later. When I was a little kid, we were still living in Riverhead. And then we went down to Virginia, Northern Virginia / Alexandria. And then in 46, we came back to New York to live in his childhood home, 9003 Parsons Boulevard in the Queens.
Oh, wow. Holy cow, you still remember the address, huh?
Yeah, it kind of burned in.
What a strange time, though. There's not a lot of people nowadays who return to their father's childhood home. But I guess at that time it also wasn't all that uncommon.
I wouldn't know, but I do know that my grandmother, whom I only met a couple of times, had to run for a long time a boarding house there at 9003. It was 3 stories, and there was one bathroom that all the renters had to use. And my Uncle John occupied a room on the 3rd floor that faced the street. So you had, for the time, a very well-lighted room that looked into the leaves and the trees out on Parsons Boulevard. I even have to gesture with my hands to kind of sweep to show you the width. It was not a grand panorama, but it was the best lighted room in the house. And I took over what was Uncle John's room eventually, so I could see the horse chestnuts and stuff like that on the street, see them blossom, see them put down little horse chestnuts in fall, which was a collecting craze for kids of our age back in grade school. And they're beautiful little things. They're like little marvelously textured wood, shiny, bright nuts. They're not edible, but they were called horse chestnuts, and they're very beautiful on their own. And we used to collect them, and when they start to deteriorate, we'd have to dump them in the trash.
So it just kind of dawned on me, now that I know the timeline, your parents were actually pretty fortunate because Grandpa Ralph was not just employed, but fairly well employed through the height of the Depression. Okay,
my cousin Bob, who was about a dozen, maybe 15 years older than I am, who flew in World War II. But before World War II, soon after he got out of high school, as I understand it, my father asked him to go get or to take the Packard, which was then an expensive car, and bring it from Texas back to New York, because Pop was then working in New York and couldn't leave the city. He was needed where he was in the city. And my cousin was thrilled because his Uncle Martin, who was the youngest of his nuclear family, was rich, sophisticated, well-traveled, and here he is, a kid being asked to go all the way to Texas, pick up his expensive car, and bring it all the way back to New York.
He took a train, didn't he?
He probably took a train to get down there,
to Texas.
But then he drove the car back from Texas.
Must have taken him 2 weeks.
I don't know how long it took, but Bob told me at one point he had a minor fender bender. And he didn't know what on earth to do with bringing a fender-bendered car, one of the right fenders, or one of the left or right front fenders had been dinged, and it had to be fixed. And he found a guy who fixed it cheaply. And when he got home with the car to New York, he goes to my father and says, "I did have an accident on the way. I've had it fixed. You tell me which side got damaged." Pop looked it over and picked the side that never had been damaged as the one that had been damaged. So whoever did the work for my cousin Ted my cousin Bob did a great job of fixing the car for him. But he was sweating bringing that car back to my father.
What year was that?
Necessarily, I'd say somewhere 39, 40.
Okay.
That's as close as I can get.
Okay,
it.
so, all right, so Yeah, all right. For a second, I thought he had done it during the Depression, but still, I mean,
But he was
the state
out
of roads.
No, he was out of the country during the Depression, or most of it, and he was very well paid, and he was living as an American on a very low-cost economy.
Yeah.
So he was living very well. He had a servant or two working for them down in Argentina.
Out of curiosity, we'll say, and you're probably just going to be making an absolute guess, complete and total shot in the dark. In 31 or 32, how much do you think his salary was? How much money? Because now this is kind of the height of the Depression. I'm just kind of curious.
Okay, I cannot guess, but I can tell you this. Now, this is going to sound ridiculous because the only number I have, it was very bad manners to ask, at least in my father's family and at his social level, it was very bad manners to ask how much money you make. Mm-hmm. Retroactively, a number of years later, I found out that in 1949, the last year he was with IT&T, we were in New York, and he was making a gross salary of $18,000. That, however, was approximately 3 times what a skilled laborer was making at the same time, because then that average was around $5,000.
Yeah.
So he was doing quite well for himself.
Yeah, he was making the equivalent of
I have no idea what
6 figures and change, a good 6-figure
a very
salary.
hefty 5 figures, perhaps.
No, I'm saying today.
Today's
economy, probably a healthy
it might
6
have
figure.
snuck over 6 figures, but the thing is this, that was such bad manners. And I never mentioned that I saw what he had been making in the civilian world when he quit IT&T. I don't think, was that quiet with you guys about how much money I was making.
No.
But that was very bad manners at the time.
Yeah.
And back then, they did not have, as far as I know, they did not have 401ks. They didn't have retirement plans. You damn well better stash your money away.
Yeah.
Which I have never met a male Ralph, except Bob Ralph, who was good at stashing money away and still living well.
Interesting. I mean, wow. Yeah. I mean, it would make sense that, that was a time that no one, that definitely was a generation that was untrustworthy of the banks in a put your money in stocks or 401 kind of way. The world's a different world today. But, so when you guys moved back to New York, or even during that time, between like 42 to 45, as you get a little bit older and the country kind of gets deeper into the war, what was there a, because we hear that there was this collective memory, this scar on the American psyche of Pearl Harbor.
Okay.
In reality at the time, was it that deep or was it that true, do you think?
I will say it this way, because I don't know any other way to say it. I know we lost a huge amount of our fleet in World War II, okay, especially at Pearl Harbor. But one thing I think the Roosevelt administration had been doing was prepare, because it seemed inevitable to a realistic observer, that the Germans and the Japanese were going to press their hope to take over the world or a substantial part of it. So our aircraft carriers were saved by where they were at the time. I don't know where that part of the fleet was, but the battleships and stuff that went under were a huge loss. Some of them were refloated. Some of them just have stayed in the bottom of Pearl Harbor and are permanent tombs. I'm afraid I lost track of your question, however. So ask me that question again.
It's okay. Was the idea of Pearl Harbor, was it something that in this atrocity Was it spoken of in those terms? Did people speak of it as remembering where they were when they heard?
The answer there is yes. I was not one of those who remembered because I was a small kid, but very frequently at school, there would be what are, I think, still called parent-teacher organization meetings. Mm-hmm. And before they'd start, because then they didn't have the formality of meeting after school, things like that. Things were busy, and they would meet during the school day at my particular school. And I will never forget all the mommies, because it was mostly mommies who were home. The daddies were doing war work or were in the war. And the faculty and the teachers all singing Remember Pearl Harbor, which is a very stirring song. I couldn't sing it without guidance at this point, but I will not forget hearing it time and again in my own school, at the Groveton School as an elementary student.
Wow.
So yes, it made a mark, and like most music that's generated by war times, the music is very stirring. Mm-hmm. And I would point out that one of the things that Hitler used so effectively was music.
Yeah.
And those who have ever heard the Horst Wessel Lied, which means the Horst Wessel song, which was written by a brown shirt, a fairly high-ranking brown shirt who then was killed. But he wrote a song about eventually we'll have our freedom and enough food again. It's very stirring to hear it. But if then you read a translation of the lyric, it becomes something very else again to an American. Because it essentially says, make way for the brown battalions. We're going to get this country right again. The brown battalions, of course, being Hitler's brown shirts.
Yeah. The precursor to what became the National Socialist Society, the Nazis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was an honor to have been one of the original brown shirts.
Yeah.
And Horst Wessel is the one who wrote the Horst Wessel Lied. And I think he was as much as what would have been called then a battalion commander, probably 100 guys under him, and he got killed. And they adapted that and adopted that as part of the national anthem.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was not the official national anthem, but if you were at a Nazi gathering, you may have sung whatever the official Deutschland über alles, but then you'd sing the Horst Wessel Lied as well. It's like singing the national anthem and then singing God Bless America.
Oh, okay.
One is automatically accompanied by the other.
Okay. Wow.
And I did not know how stirring it was until recently I looked it up for reasons I will not discuss here. But I was able to find it on net, recently recorded in Germany by a very fine choir, and it's very stirring. And then you read the translation, and, well, the Marseillaise is a war song, essentially.
Yeah.
And it's very stirring. The national anthem for this country is very stirring. It was a war song.
I don't think anyone quite tied the theatrics together like Hitler with his. I mean, it was in a strictly objective theatrical sense. The lighting, the music. It was.
I got
really
an answer
impressive.
for you on that. I got an answer for you on that, and it's the visual answer. A long time ago and far, far away in Germany, there was a beautiful, famous dancer named Leni, Leni, Riefenstahl.
Yeah.
And she was injured. She could no longer dance. She turned to the graphic arts and became a very good photographer, or maybe a great photographer, but then she became a filmmaker. And she made a movie called The Power of the Will in translation, okay? And that, if you've ever seen it, you get this impression, an overwhelming visual impression of the grandness of the Third Reich when it was still an infant.
Yeah.
And she was the one who essentially, Goebbels was a nutcase.
Brilliant nutcase.
Yes, but Leni Riefenstahl was Hitler's great visual artist, and she was really the one who put him on the map across the world when magazines were all over, and you couldn't help but lift photographs taken from the same place where she'd put the movie cameras and stuff like that.
Yeah.
She was brilliant.
Yeah.
And unfortunately brilliant in the service of evil.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And
yeah, because when you see there wasn't a speech that didn't involve it was like you said, everything was done on a grand scale. Huge, the banners draped, the lighting, the contrast.
Let me
of
say
lighting.
it this way: the Russians did the same sort of thing, but they did not have Leni Riefenstahl.
Yeah,
she was the great designer. The Russians had the same magnitude, but they didn't have her, and it never reached the world the way she reached the world visually.
Do you think it was this? Do you think with your eye and your background and your extensive experience with photography, do you think it would have been as powerful in color as it was in black and white? Do you think
yes.
in person? Yeah.
Oh,
really?
yeah. Because one thing you had was, let's put it this way, the whole world as a photographer, if you take all the colors and blend them together, they come out strangely as a neutral gray.
Okay.
The whole universe, the whole earth, if you take all the colors and blend them together, they become a neutral gray.
Okay.
Strange, but that's how it sort of sums up. And most of the German uniforms were gray or gray-green.
Uh-huh.
Okay, but then you slap a red armband.
Oh, yeah, a lot of visual
red,
pop.
white, and black.
Yeah.
I mean, even today they've come back as visually startling. Say Verizon uses that mix, or did use that mix for a while, but a guy like me who's seen how Leni Riefenstahl used it, it is the mark, red, white, and black of Nazi Germany. You never let that go.
Yeah, I guess I would just I mean
those
I think about
colors
the
would have
rallies.
popped out of all that gray, especially the gloriously big flags, red with a swastika on it. You couldn't beat that with a stick.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking more along the lines of the rallies because of the way they lit them with giant fires and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, but the troops
in the black
were
and
all
white, it popped out different.
Oh, well, yes, it did, but the troops were always arranged in such a way that they made
beautifully.
magnificent landscapes.
Yeah.
They were peoplescapes, but they were landscapes, and then the people themselves, they were at random, but here were the troops, and they were in line division by division, or at least regiment by regiment. So you had this enormous sweep of all these troops, and then this fabulous German rabble out beyond it, or else
in a close order drill sense, it's mind-boggling. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, you really, if you haven't spent a few hundred hours practicing close order drill, you can't fully appreciate how impressive that was. And not only that, like you said, they were selected. So to have that visual perfection, you can only have a couple of inches of deviation, both in height and width and depth and everything like that. So I mean, you're really looking for a certain type with a certain body type and a certain weight. I mean, there's a lot of
not just that, but the thing is, you may be stuck with guys who are anywhere from 6'5" down to 5'9" or 5'5". But if you arrange them correctly, you don't care. You see this sweeping line, you don't even notice it's shorter or longer because there are no bumps in it.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
It's
but a lot of those
straight
guys are
sweep.
so far back. I'm sure they set it up so that they mixed up the battalion so that you had the perfect Aryan giants.
Exactly.
In the
but
foreground.
The thing is, without somebody with the extraordinary gift for design and manipulation,
Yeah.
who was also, in those days, a woman?
Yeah. Well, she was brilliant, so
Well, yeah, but
Yeah.
a lot of brilliant women today get no credit for what they do.
yeah.
They're just women.
She must have been a force.
She was, I'm sure, she managed to survive the war even after marrying a major in the Wehrmacht, that was her second marriage as far as I know. But she survived the war, and she went on to become a very fine and sought-after photographer despite her work with the Third Reich.
Well, if you based it just objectively on her work, I mean, if you looked at her work objectively, she was a fantastic photographer, and if you want one of the best,
yeah,
there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I don't give a shit what you did. Just do that for me.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And she made a famous series of photographs of a tribe in Africa, and she did work. She finally passed away at 101. She lived a long, long time. I will never forget the masterminding of the evil she did. But other people saw past that. They didn't say to themselves, this is a Riefenstahl photograph. They said, this is a fabulous photograph. I don't care who took it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if she ever expressed any regret publicly for the part she played in the Third Reich because it was enormous. She was really his great propagandist.
Yeah. She was the executor. Yeah, definitely. Well, she was the director and the executive
designer,
producer.
Director. She was everything. And
did she do, do you know, this is kind of out of left field, did she ever do color work or was it mostly black and white?
Yeah. Her work after the war when color became more usable.
So Kodak?
It's likely. Yeah. There were certainly German color films, but one thing as far as I know, and this is a very limited limitation, the Americans perfected film that would lie flat, which might seem strange to you, but most films before Kodak and DuPont came along would curl.
Oh, okay.
And they were notoriously difficult to keep stable physically. And I'm not sure when the English and the Germans and the French got a hold of it, but I can remember back in the early 60s having a difficult time when I bought what was then a popular, good-looking German film from an outfit called Perwutz, and it was still curly. Great color, but the damn slides would roll up on you. So I'm sure she probably used American-based films because they were far more workable. I don't know if the color was more durable, but the films were more manageable by a long shot.
So you can clearly remember, even though if you don't remember every word of the lyric, but you still have vivid memory of hearing this Remember Pearl Harbor song.
Oh, yes.
And then, you obviously have a vivid memory having lived through it, and this was kind of the time you were going from being a little boy into an older boy and then a young man. Was there in say like 51, did Pearl Harbor still resonate with Americans?
Okay. You're talking about a 10-year period.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And there had been a whole lot happened, and one of the things that intervened almost in the middle, a little short of the middle, maybe a third of the way in, was the use of the atomic bomb.
Yeah.
Okay? And that, I can remember as, 45, I was 7 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear about it. I'm a little kid in Virginia. And less than a year later, who comes up with the atomic bomb ring but the Lone Ranger? The atomic bomb ring.
Okay, gotcha.
Shaped like a bomb. You could look inside and watch some harmless radioactive material deteriorate and go off a little sparkle every time an atom kind of came apart.
The Lone Ranger, a cowboy in the Old West,
yes,
had a atom bomb ring.
Yes, they did.
Interesting. Okay.
Yes.
They definitely took liberties with radio stories.
Well, okay. Well, he didn't have an ad. They were sold independently through the program, but somehow or other, the Lone Ranger got mixed up with helping somebody protect their uranium mine, which in his day they couldn't figure out what it was good for. So then they could get a atom bomb ring out of that somehow.
Wow.
But, hey, I was in on it already, man. I wanted my atom bomb ring.
Wow, what a fascinating, forgotten pop culture thing. Wow. I mean, the radio shows were different then. I mean, they were, they were
15
something
minutes.
you turned in.
15 minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. 15 minutes pop. Sky King, The Lone Ranger, I forget what else.
And you were
Tennessee
riveted, right?
Jed. Say again?
You were riveted, right? I mean,
Yeah. Come on. 15 minutes. They pack a lot into 15 minutes and still sell atomic bomb rings or whatever else is the premium of that month.
I guess Americans have always kind of had short attention spans. 15-minute show.
Well, no, they were targeted at little kids.
Yeah. Who have short attention spans.
Yes, I mean,
not
even
ADD,
now.
they're just kids.
Or to quote myself, what's your name, son, on the other side of this mic? I have a short attention span.
Yeah.
Yes, nothing personal, just the way it is. As you said, when I get older and a little demented, I'll have a new friend every day.
This is true.
And yes, you're my new friend right now. But the thing is, yes, they had atom bomb rings, and what it was, let me see. It was a ring, it would fit on a kid's hand, and it was a little bomb-shaped thing, and you took the tail off the bomb, and you held the ring up to your eye, so you're looking in the bomb end of it, the blow-up end, and you could see in the dark little sparkles as the radioactivity of something very harmless would simply give up one energy shell at a time.
Huh.
And yes, you could see atomic energy at work.
Oh, neat.
From the Lone Ranger.
That's cool.
Put your atom bomb ring together, put it back together, put it on your hand, walk around being cool.
So, in your opinion then,
Yes.
probably rightly so, Pearl Harbor was big, but then not even 5 years later, 4 years later, less than 4 years later, the atomic bomb had a bigger, a more lasting effect on the psyche.
Well, there's
So by like 51, the whole nuclear, the beginning of the Cold War and everything
the
ramping
thing
up
is,
kind of overshadowed that.
Here we are. I will not say Pearl Harbor was forgotten, but one of the things we did, because the ancient Greeks used to say, never go to war with a democracy. Because if they've got to win, they'll do anything to win. Anything.
Mm-hmm.
And we did the atomic bomb to win.
Yeah.
To really put a conclusion to it.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a couple more stashed away. And after we set off the second one over Nagasaki, they told the world very openly, we've got more of these. You got a choice. You surrender, or we'll use them on you. And they were not private about that through diplomatic channels. They probably were, but they made it very public. Yeah, we just dropped 2 of these things, and we got more where that came from.
Mm-hmm.
Surrender or else. Unconditional surrender. And a lot of people felt that demanding an unconditional surrender was a mistake. I don't think it was, because that's what we needed to have happen to prevent a bloodbath on the shores of Japan.
Yeah.
We let him keep the emperor. We tried a lot of the top generals who survived and admirals as war criminals, which my oldest brother Pete always felt was crooked, because that had never happened before, where the criminals on one side, on the losing side, were tried as criminals rather than just as the perpetrators of a war. They were tried for 2 reasons, and he felt that was what's called in constitutional law an ex post facto proposition. However, I disagree with my beloved and lost brother. This had to happen.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned. The bomb had to be used as far as I'm concerned. It was a frightful thing. Both of them were frightful things. But it was the only thing that would convince the Japanese that they were really on the losing side. And they had lost. And we imposed the government on them, just as we did on the Germans, but we treated them with as much decency as we could under the circumstances. And yes, there were a few guys at the top that died, but not legions and legions of lower ranking people. They went home, just like they did after the Civil War.
Yeah.
And I think that's something, I don't know if we learned it from Lincoln or if Lincoln you learned it from somebody else, but he taught this country, in victory, be generous.
Yeah.
And considering what he had seen and read of the aftermath of the French Revolution, he knew what could happen if you weren't generous in victory.
In that vein, that makes me think of something. I don't know if I've ever asked you this. I probably have at some point in the past 20 years. But that statement, that what we learned from Lincoln, and not sure where he learned it, but to be generous in victory. How do you feel that how does it make you feel, or what do you think when you hear people say that we're an imperialist nation? Because that's not that statement is not a statement that would be applied to an imperial power.
Let's try it this way. Who is the single holder of the most congressional medals of honor? He's a Marine general. I can't remember his name. A Marine general holds more congressional medals of honor than anybody else. He's a multiple CMH holder. He was the guy who essentially...
Dan Daly?
No. He was a general.
Oh, Smedley.
There you are, Smedley.
Butler.
Okay.
Does Smedley Butler have more than Audie Murphy? Audie might have only had one, but Audie had more decorations. But you're right.
Yes,
okay,
I'm
so yeah,
only
okay,
the CMH here.
Yep.
Only
Okay,
CMH.
yeah, Smedley Butler.
Okay, now Mr. Butler earned them from a grateful Congress, and they were doing the will through him of one of the great fruit companies of this country. Mm-hmm. And Smedley Butler, this is a quote as close as I can, we shot cacas like dogs.
Yeah.
They were an Indian tribe who lived in the fruit nations.
Mm-hmm.
And
I know Smedley Butler's parting words. Yeah. Well, I know his speech. I don't
know it as well, but all I know is he lived to regret what he had done.
He felt he was a gun for hire.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Then in that era, we certainly were an imperial nation. That era was a long time back.
Yeah, what's referred to as like a banana republic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
that's the late 1800s, the late 19th century, early 20th.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think, and I'm not being leftist here, I think we were then dreaming of being an imperial power. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt put together the Great White Fleet to show the world, hey, we're not second raters anymore.
Yeah, I think, sure. I think there's probably validity there, but I think we were a rising power in what at the time was an imperial world. This is prior to World War I. And World War I arguably is the beginning of the end for imperialism. And I would say that you actually see the final death throes of one of the big imperial powers being France, which is actually post-World War II. People say it's World War II. It's not actually post. I mean, really, Vietnam is one of the what happened in Vietnam and their exit and our support and then our getting entangled is a tail-end final death throw of imperial power.
Okay, there are a number of those. There are a number of those instances. The British Empire, Winston Churchill was very opposed to its being dissolved while he was prime minister, but it did happen. And even smaller countries were terrible imperial powers in their own small way, Belgium being among the worst. Mm-hmm. Because what happened in the Congo, the English and the French could have learned a lot of horror stories from them.
Yeah.
And they were not the nicest people on the planet, nor were the Germans at that time, except they were less capable of running an empire. They didn't quite have the bent for it.
Nor were the Dutch in South Africa.
Bingo.
I mean, okay. Yeah, I mean, Yeah, there's a lot that people
Yeah.
forget and don't know. Yeah.
Right. But the thing is
Afrikaans.
this country, I think, and this is the tightrope that our leaders now need to walk. A long time ago, General MacArthur very wisely said, never get into a war in mainland Asia. He might have had an ego the size of Mount Rushmore all his own, but he was a damn smart military guy. He's one of the few people I ever heard of who talk about himself in the third person.
Consistently.
Yes. However, he was right. We got into a war on mainland Asia in Vietnam. It was a mistake.
We did in Korea before Vietnam.
Yes, but we found out that we were limited by the presence of a very great power just north of South Korea and North Korea, who indeed intervened at some point when it looked like we were going to drive the Koreans right back to the Chinese border. And we learned that the 38th parallel, which marked off the difference between North and South Korea, was a good place to stay and stop.
Yeah. It's interesting that, it was MacArthur was in charge of those forces.
Yes.
Yeah.
But,
made this statement.
he said that long before Korea.
Oh, I know. Well, yeah, MacArthur, look, you're right. He was absolutely an egomaniac. So was Patton for that matter. But, you mentioned the Marshall Plan in Europe. You had the MacArthur Plan in Japan.
Yes.
And he knew, he had been in the Philippines. He had been in Asia for a long time.
Oh, yes.
And there was also, going back to your point about pre-World War I rise, a lot of what we did was imperialist-like.
Oh, yes.
So he was a specialist in the South Pacific because of the time he spent there, because that's where he was stationed.
Right.
Much like when you were part of the Crown, when you got sent to India, you went to freaking India and you brought your entire family.
Oh, yes.
And you became it took years, but you became not just an emissary of the Crown, but you also became an expert on local customs and understanding the nuances of which made it easier, or it made you better at managing the holdings of the Crown.
Well, as someone pointed out to me, this is not original with me, the British were uniquely adept at colonialism because they'd take over a country like India and then they would train the Indians to run the country for them. They would teach them the ways of Great Britain and how a country is to be administered. But these people were able to take over independence because they did know from the Brits how to run their country. The Belgians didn't do that.
Yeah.
I don't know if the French ever really did.
I would say the Brits probably just, I don't know if they did purposely, but they learned it from the Romans.
Okay, fair enough. But however they did it, when they took over New York.
Yeah.
They did from the Dutch.
Yep.
They immediately put locals in charge, and they were answerable to the crown.
Yeah, I guess now that I think about it, I guess they were a little too good at colonialism because they ended up losing everything that they started.
Yes, but they lost it to, in large part, functional replacement governments.
Yeah, the students becoming teachers.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's true. We had, as you've pointed out, we had a long time as Americans to be acculturated to ruling ourselves because he was so far away from Mother England.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, yes.
And so was India for all practical purposes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they had to
one could argue further.
Yes, but they had to teach the locals how to run their own country. And then when they were finally de-empired, the conflicts that followed, Pakistan, Bangladesh, those were relatively minor compared to what happened in the Congo and in Africa, where other imperial powers pulled out, and they had never given natives a hope of learning how to run a country on the behalf of their masters back in the homeland.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it. Wow.
And I'm not saying the Africans are stupid. I'm saying the Africans are plenty bright, but you're seeing the same kind of struggles for power in the Balkans still.
Oh, yeah.
All white and all power crazed, and everybody is a warlord.
Yeah.
And it's true in Africa as well. If they
the
had,
former Yugoslavia is a great example.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
it's no different. Yeah. And the only reason that we even stepped in, and I've always said this, the only reason we stepped in the former Yugoslavia is because it was in the backyard of Europe. You can't have that happening again.
No.
I mean, that's what that was. And it's sad because what you had in the former Yugoslavia was no less of an atrocity than what you had happen in Rwanda.
Very, very true.
And the willingness to step into Rwanda there was way more reluctance. And it shouldn't have been. I mean, that's a whole nother subject, but yeah. And that's yeah.
Well, there was some remote minor parts of European culture in the Balkans that simply never was given a chance to even be born in Africa.
Except
Belgians,
for South Africa, which is a different animal, which is an anomaly. Yeah. I mean, you have South Africa. I don't think, number one, it's a giant continent.
But at the same time, South Africa is still having its early childhood problems.
Sure, yeah.
But they're the problems that were common to the United States as a young country.
I mean, considering the tension, I mean, you talk about fairly, in a civil war sense, fairly peaceful transitions. I mean, you think about the release of Nelson Mandela, the end of apartheid, and the transition to Mandela becoming president and the rise of his party. It's in like a revolutionary sense, it's fairly bloodless. It's impressively civil.
Yes, indeed.
Comparatively speaking.
Oh, yeah. Well, let's put it this way. There were some fascist remnants left in South Africa who made the mistake of putting their heads up and trying to take back little parts of the country and died in their crazed attempt.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's now the same old dandy corruption in South Africa among the new government that this government had.
Yeah.
I mean, I think of Tammany Hall in New York. I think of Chicago even relatively recently. Corruption comes with politics. Politics come with corruption.
Yep.
Keeping it clean is hard.
Very hard.
Well, worth it, but difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, I mean, I was just, you think about Africa, and it's really kind of the central belt of Africa that's the deepest part of the continent that's had the most trouble because, you have South Africa, which is a big chunk of the southern portion, hence the name South Africa. And then in northern Africa has always been a strange animal because of its proximity to the Mediterranean. But even in ancient times, it was a different animal. You look at, there were always, North Africa has always been seems to have been populated by Arabic and Mediterranean peoples that you'll find. So, I mean, you could, in the ancient world, you could go from Greece right around the Mediterranean, and they would all be fairly similar. They were a Mediterranean
the
type
Great
people.
Sea was the unifying
and they were
geographical presence.
Yeah, they were visibly different than if you went into Northern Europe, you got into your Viking-like looking people. And if you went into Africa, it became much darker. So you see a people who are fairly similar skin tone wise and all that you see on like in ancient Egypt. You could see that throughout the Mediterranean speckling in. More of your Spanish, southern Spain, southern Italy. These peoples are all kind of very similar in color and tone, skin wise, and stuff like that. But anyways, that's different. So yeah, it's sorry. There's a lot of different places we could go with it. But I do have a question. Speaking of Africa and you making the allusion to to South Africa and the parallels with our country. When you were a little boy and you moved back to New York,
Yep.
And you lived there until, when did you guys move from New York up to Vermont?
We were there from 46 to 49.
Okay, 46.
It was a surprisingly brief period in retrospect, but it was a long 3 years for me.
Okay, so you're from about 7 to about 10? Or 8 to 11?
8 to 11.
Okay, so this is a time, it became more prominent, especially when we look back on it, now from present time. But were you aware of segregation? Did you see like the whites only water fountains and coloreds, and were you aware of that?
I will answer that as best I can.
Okay.
Okay, and it takes several ways to do it. First of all, my understanding from my older brothers was that you don't wear blue jeans or overalls made of denim because those are the garments of poor people.
Huh.
Back then.
Okay.
And that often meant when you lived in a white society, and this I'm looking back, I'm not looking at directly as a small kid. Those were usually the collars that were worn by blacks. However, I think I got cured of most of my racism by my brother, Tony.
Okay. Interesting. That's an interesting way of putting it.
But we get there sideways.
Okay.
We don't get there directly.
Oh, go sideways. This is fascinating to me.
Okay.
You hadn't heard it. I may have mentioned it to your mom, but basically, he and I are walking home from Alexandria to Franconia Road, and we're just across from the Dew Drop Inn, DEWDROP, Dew Drop Inn. Uh-huh.
Okay. During the war, we'd go by, and if we had together whatever it took, we'd buy a Coke, and occasionally there'd be young soldiers there, and they'd buy us a Coke. But we were not habitués of the Dew Drop Inn. But one day on the way, not quite there, he started to beat up on me. My brother Tony, he was my older brother, and then I was littler than him. I grew up bigger than him, but I was littler than him.
Yeah, he was older than you by 2 years.
Year and a half, yeah.
Okay, year and a half.
Anyway, he starts to beat up on me, and a black kid, maybe a year older than Tony, comes along, pulls him off me, and stops him from beating up on me.
How old were you
He
then?
didn't hit him. I think I was still preschool.
Okay, you were a little kid.
I was a little kid, and he was a bigger little kid, and this was a bigger little kid who happened to be black, and pulled him off me and told him not to do it anymore, and he was ticked. Tony was ticked because he'd been interrupted in doing what he felt was necessary.
Big brother's duties.
Right. But at that point, without my being aware of it, I looked on that black kid as my rescuer. Now, it's very difficult to look at one member.
This is definitely a roundabout way. It's not how I expected you to tell me that Tony cured you of it.
This is how I could see a black person being the rescuer of a white person. This is profound subconscious stuff, if I may say so.
Yeah, I mean, you're 4 years old, 5 years old. Yeah.
And this bigger black kid comes and bails me out of being beaten up by my brother. He didn't hurt Tony. He just stopped him.
Uh-huh.
He did not beat up on him. He simply somehow got him away from me so he could beat me up and made sure he wouldn't beat me up anymore while he was present. And it didn't last long. And then he walked home with me. And he was kind of cranky about it, but he didn't try anything more. And I think he's one of the very few black people I ever encountered in Northern Virginia. Now, I don't know if you remember Matt Brooks, a good friend of your mom.
Yes.
Okay. He said, because he's lived in Northern Virginia for a long time, that Northern Virginia is a very different country from the rest of Virginia.
Okay.
In that they have a lot of imported people, like we were.
Yeah, a lot of carpetbaggers.
A lot of carpetbaggers, and we were among them. but they kind of dominate that area to the extent that I never encountered any black people. I lived with whites. I dealt with whites. The first time I ran into a serious number of black people was when I went to the Museum of Natural History in New York as a youngster after we'd moved up there. And there were black people doing clerical, administrative, and other work at the Museum of Natural History. Now, that's not to say there wasn't a form of economic segregation, because there was.
Sure.
But the thing is, and I still recall when you asked me that question, that black people are people first and black. People are people first and yellow. They are people first and Indians. And I will admit to sometimes my wondering, can I really trust this person who is of a different skin color?
Really?
And then I have to remind myself that I have encountered, I think in most of us, there's some residuum, very small perhaps, because my father was the one who said that it was in America that Jewish people were allowed to be human. He was not anti-Semitic. I knew a lot of anti-Semites in Woodstock, well-off WASP lawyers, but I also knew Jewish people in Woodstock for whom I worked. And hey, when you grow up in New York City, when you grow up in the Queens, and the funniest guy in the class is Michael Stroh, followed by Michael Abrams, and Michael Abrams has the courage to kiss Marjorie Goff, the prettiest girl in the class. When we're in the third grade, what's going on here? You don't think of them as Jewish because the culture is very heavily Hebrewified, if you will. So that's my culture, sort of. They were not a minority group, as far as I was concerned. They were people like everybody else.
Yeah.
They happened to go to synagogues. My Cub Scout troop was in a synagogue less than 2 blocks from my public school. There's a value, a human value, in a cosmopolitan place.
Yeah.
I may resent calls from the subcontinent promising to fix my computer from halfway around the globe, but I don't have it in for them towel heads, as I have heard some people call people from the Far East or from India or the subcontinent. They're just people trying to make a living, like the shark who has an American accent and is calling from somewhere else, offering to power wash my house or make it secure.
Yeah.
They are maybe not reputable business people, but I know whole bunches of white people who aren't reputable business people either.
Yeah.
Stop at any used car lot and see what happens. Nothing personal. It's strictly business.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So I'm not sure where this diversion got us, but basically my brother cured me of a lot of my potential racism.
That's hugely fascinating. I did not know that. Maybe I think now that you tell me, I think I do remember hearing it before, but it didn't stick, and now it most certainly will. But do you remember? Well, I don't know. Do you remember visually? Do you remember a segregated America? Because I mean, you see, 54 is Brown v. Board, which is right. which is it's earth shattering in a lot of ways for us as a nation. But I mean, that's the beginning of a different era. So, and you were 16 at that time. So, but you still have it's going into effect for another 12 years? Okay. 68's the Civil Rights, the Voters' Right Act, right? So you have, yeah. Anyways, do you remember a pre segregation America? Do you remember seeing signs that say, I don't know.
Whites only? No, they
whites
weren't
only,
in
stuff like
Northern
that.
Virginia, as far as I know. I
Okay.
could read before I left, and I could read very well.
Okay.
I don't recall encountering that. But remember, I was then and moved to New York City, which in our area was, again, lily white, and then to Vermont, where the only black person I knew of was a member of our church in the Episcopal Church, but he was it. And he then, I don't know how well educated, he was clearly educated, but maybe not well enough educated to make it into being part of Episcopal clergy in Lillywhite, Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
His last name was Hazard. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened to Mr. Hazard. He was a nice guy, but he was the black in Woodstock.
Wow.
His son was, as far as I know, not doing well in school. How he was treated, I don't know, because he's a good deal older than I was, so he was beyond my ability to even contact him or know about him and his life.
Mm-hmm.
I knew a little bit about the grade ahead of me, a little bit about the grade behind me, but mostly it was centered at my age grade level, and Vermont at that time was very clearly lily white, as far as I knew.
Mm-hmm. And Woodstock only became more so.
It became a lot richer with the advent of Mr. Rockefeller. Whether it became less lily white, I don't know. It's been so long since.
Well,
I've
I
been
would
gone.
say in that period, in that brief period, as the Rockefellers came in and it became more. There's going to be there's probably a 10 or 20 year time where it became even more so, just because of economic stratification.
So what
and stuff like
I
that.
remember is this, and I can't peg the year. I remember Eisenhower, and this is a discussion we had a long time ago. I remember Eisenhower having to send the 101st Airborne to, I think it was Arkansas, maybe it was Mississippi, to enforce it because the National Guard in that state.
Arkansas, yeah.
Arkansas. And I remember thinking, this is a good thing, but it's for the wrong reasons. It had to be done. Because, as I told you then, National Guard's persons, with all due respect to them at that time, were essentially local kids, local officers, and they totally were a reflection of the local population.
Yeah.
And they were not the highly disciplined military force, the 101st, the 82nd, or even some of the better infantry outfits were. Mm-hmm. Where it didn't make a toot what color you were, although at that time they were mostly white as well. Mm-hmm. But they could follow orders. They knew how to say yes, sir. They knew how to say no, sir. They knew they didn't need to pull weapons because their very presence was enough to convince people that they were in charge. Mm-hmm. They didn't have to throw their weight around. I remember your disappointment when you went to either Cambodia or Laos, that nothing happened. You were under the command of an army star.
It was Thailand.
Thailand, okay.
It was.
But the thing is...
we were recalled. We ended up in Thailand, sitting in Thailand,
right,
waiting to get the call if we had to go into Phnom Penh.
Exactly.
When
the thing is this, though.
Finally, in their last gasp, fell, and it became...
Right.
Yeah, that was 97.
Somewhere in there, but you were in the Corps and you were sorry that action didn't happen. But what I tried to tell you on the phone even then was your presence as a deterrent force made all the difference, and their presence as a deterrent force. They didn't have to use force. They were the 101st and they were highly disciplined. They didn't reach for their weapons and start shooting. If they ran into difficulty, they knew what to do, even though they weren't cops.
Yeah, it's interesting, just as a little side that you bring that up, to parallel the difference in how much the world has changed in about 20 years or so. When we got recalled, it was right as I was wrapping up my second deployment in Okinawa, and we were about, and I was assault in the Corps at that time. It was the end of my second deployment, and everything was still phone call and letters back then. We wrote a final letter home. It got sent 2 days afterwards. You and Mom had no idea where I was. You turn on CNN and you see what's going on in Phnom Penh, and you mentioned that, and you said to Mom, or at least you told me, you told Mom.
Well, it was
at that moment,
NPR. I knew
NPR,
what was
you
going
knew where
on.
I
Yeah.
was.
Necessarily.
Yeah, you knew where I was.
Yeah.
You were fairly confident that I was part of the U.S. forces that were positioned to go into Phnom Penh if necessary to extract U.S. citizens. You were like, oh, that's where Stefan is.
Yeah.
Or he's somewhere in there. He's around there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I didn't
Whereas
know.
now today, people would see it on YouTube and Facebook and everything else within minutes.
Yeah. But the thing is, if you have some acquaintance, and I don't mean know it well, some working acquaintance with the world around you, sometimes the events can be read correctly.
Yes.
You don't know the fine points, but you have a vague sense of what's going on here. A vague sense. And I think that in many places, including this country, when a news organization is in the pocket, as newspapers like Mr. Hearst's newspapers used to be, and as Fox News is today, in the pocket of a particular interest group, or have a particular political slant, you're going to get contaminated news. Now, one thing I saw indicated by one of the wisest current publicly available wise priests of the time is that this is a consumer culture, and everybody is promoting, in one way or another, consumerism.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't mind a guy who wants to sell me tires or cars as long as the news is relatively straight.
Yeah.
With Fox News, with other news organizations, I don't know how straight the news is anymore, because on NPR, which is usually fairly straight, I can sense, without being hostile, I can sense a certain left bias. Okay, but it's a bias. It's not a total surrender. Like I think of the very lovely doctor who's running as an independent candidate for president. And she's discussing this government as though the government currently in place in the United States, as though it were ready to essentially let's put it this way. It reads like old, very left-wing screeds about how this nation is imperialist and willing to drain the blood of its citizens to do what it wants. I mean...
Yeah, she's the Green Party candidate. Jill.
She's a physician.
Yep.
She's very smart, but she has a very serious left-wing populist bias.
Do you know who else was a very smart physician with a very strong left-wing bias?
Well, I don't know if he's got a left-wing bias. Dr. Carson?
No, Che Guevara. Che Guevara was.
Yes, he was. He was. Yeah, well, I don't think...
I don't know if he ever actually finished. I can't remember if he actually finished his
he had an MD.
Physician's.
I'm pretty sure he had an MD.
I don't actually remember if he did. I think he might have actually...
It's irrelevant.
Yeah.
He was highly trained. He was highly intelligent.
Yeah, I was just saying a physician with left-leaning who referred to us as imperialist pigs.
Ms. Stein is...
Jill Stein.
A bit nearer the center than he is. But I'm finding it a little hard to... I heard only a very brief quote from her, but I kind of blinked when I heard it and said, what? And that's all I'll say, because I don't have a grip. But I can understand her concerns, but not to the nature of this being a fascist country already and quickly going to the stormtroopers and oppressing every minority in sight.
Yeah. Something I always found rather interesting was that, and I believe it's still to this day, this is really interesting. You still, I believe, carry a grudge towards John Kennedy.
JFK?
Yeah. I don't know if grudge is the right word, but I know at one time you still had palpable aggravation towards him for almost bringing us to the brink.
I think I backed off a bit on that.
But you did have it. My memory's not wrong.
I don't think, but I'm not so sure in retrospect that he brought us to the brink.
Okay.
I do believe it was a bungling of foreign policy, which was a almost organic outgrowth of our isolating Cuba, which I think started in the Eisenhower administration. Whenever Fidel took over is when it happened.
Yeah, it was after the revolution.
Yeah, but I don't remember, God forgive me, I don't remember the date of the revolution. All I remember is seeing in Life magazine, still living at home, so it was prior to 56, pictures of people being executed under Fidel as he was taking Cuba over.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in all fairness, it wasn't one-sided, the isolation, that's for sure. I mean, they chose that. I mean, they were, within their own, to go back to Che Guevara, one of Che's biggest points of contention with the Castros was he was rather he wasn't disenchanted. He was actually disgusted with Moscow. He saw Moscow and the Russians and what they were doing with communism as being a complete and total sham. He actually he was more romantically, in a communist sense, linked to Mao, and he wasn't quiet about it in the early stages of the after the revolution when they took over, and that was kind of where he started to break with them. So I mean, and I only caveat that because, or I only bring that up because when you said that the kind of isolation of Cuba, that was also very much so the Fidel Castro's position because of his alignment with Moscow and with Khrushchev and the Soviets at that time. That was a relationship he very much so sought. He aligned himself in that direction.
Okay, but one of the things that happened back then, and I don't have a good grip on the sequence, so bear with me if you will. Or don't bear with me, but correct it in your own minds if you hear me this. My understanding is that in Turkey, which was then a solid ally of the United States, we did set up some missile bases. Whether they were defensive or offensive, I don't remember. We certainly probably claimed they were defensive, but they may very well have had an offensive capability.
Did not make the Warsaw Pact very happy.
No. And the next thing we know, a Republican Senator, Kenneth Keating, one of my heroes, said very loudly, hey, them Russians are sending ships with missiles on them to Cuba as a counterbalance to those missiles we just put in Turkey. And he was the one who blew the whistle on what was happening in Cuba before President Kennedy took up the cry and said, this has got to stop. And it was a negotiating point, I don't know how it was eventually worked out, between Khrushchev and Kennedy, that both sets of missiles had to go. But how it almost moved into a nuclear, potential thermonuclear situation, I don't remember. What I remember vividly as a private citizen, living then in Springfield, but right under the flight path of what was then a Strategic Air Command base, Westover, is I'm seeing these 52s come in and leave with Tomahawk missiles, nuclear-tipped missiles coming in and going out of Westover. Now, normally those pylons on
I don't
B-50...
think they were Tomahawks.
Well, I may have the name wrong, but they were essentially nuclear and thermonuclear missiles on the pylons of those B-52s. They were ready to go if anything happened, and they were kept airborne a lot.
Yeah, they had them stacked on the runway at that time.
Not just stacked on the runway.
Yeah, in the air, yeah.
They were in the air. They were stacked on the runway for when they had to go up and fly relief for the guys who had just come back.
Yeah.
And I resented it enormously. Here I am raising a daughter, and here I am seeing these weapons, live weapons or potentially live weapons, flying over my home.
Yeah.
And I was grateful when it was resolved. And
that's when NORAD was at the Notch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The first NORAD.
Yep.
Before they said, you know what, let's go middle of the country and do some really big rocks.
Yeah, right. Which was perhaps then a good move.
Yeah.
But the thing is this. I don't know as it was Kennedy or circumstance that would have happened under any other administration, which it probably could have, Republican or Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
I'll never know. My memory of that is now very distant, but I remember the resentment of seeing these fully armed 52s. True, they had bomb bays.
Yeah.
Don't know what was in the bomb bays, but when you see these missiles stacked on the pylons, you know somebody is gunning for bear if it has to happen.
Yeah.
And very bad, very bad.
Interesting side note that leads to. Do you remember where you were when Kennedy was shot?
Yes, I was at Bloom's Photo Supply working as a clerk, and one of my colleagues happened to hear it first. And he said, my God, we got to record this real quick. And he pulled out a tape. We sold tape recorders as a very minor side business to Bloom's Photo Supply.
Okay.
And Fred Rebstock, very sharp guy, later became, as far as I know, an oceanographer when he could afford to get an education. Grabbed a tape recorder, plugged it in, and got it operational just as the announcer on whichever station we were on announced that President Kennedy had been pronounced dead.
Wow.
Okay, that he didn't get the prior stuff.
But that seminal moment.
Yes.
Boom.
Yeah. The moment I heard that, I left the store. I walked right out the back door because on the other side of the block was then an operational Franciscan friars chapel, which had been very popular. And I went in and I prayed for Kennedy and the family and the country for about 5 or 10 minutes. I knew I couldn't stay out of work.
Yeah.
But that was the first thing I did. I knew he was gone. No details on what had happened. And I just went around, literally through a back alley, and went and prayed at that Franciscan chapel and then came back to work.
Wow.
And then details started to come out as to what had happened and how it happened. And that story's not over yet. As far as many conspiracy theorists are concerned, as far as I'm concerned, the initial conclusions were correct. Lee Harvey Oswald, as far as I know, shot him. He had a second-rate rifle with a second-rate scope, but he was a very well-trained marksman. He'd probably bore-sighted his weapon, or at least made sure the damn thing could hit something at 100, 200, and maybe 75 yards. I know damn well, in my heart of hearts, he was a good shot.
Yeah.
You can't get through the Corps basic training without being a really good shot compared to the Army.
Yeah, especially
I'm
at that
certain
time.
he did it.
Yeah.
And all the other frou-frou, No, that's all food for us.
It's funny you mentioned that because you've held to that for a long time, and I went through a period where, I was doubtful and I was circumspect, and I thought, no way, it was no, and then probably 10 or 15 years ago, there was a really good documentary with a lot of information and a lot of computer modeling, and it did the proper adjustments for the interesting seating arrangements inside the car, because the car he was in was modified with the governor. It wasn't just a standard Lincoln. It was actually modified seating arrangements and stuff like that. So,
any car for a big shot is dealt with in some way or another like that. Yes.
It was modified for other reasons. But it wasn't modified to an external viewer. So if you just look at that model of Lincoln, and you're like, oh, well, this is where they seat. But no, he was elevated. It was an offset passenger seat.
Right.
There's a lot of things that when you dig into this, and that information was plugged into the computer model, now all of a sudden, what seems like these magical bullet theories and stuff like that erode. And the trajectories actually fit into modeling. And when I saw that, I remember watching it and watching all this stuff unfold. And if nothing else, I've always been willing to concede in the face of what I see to be very daunting evidence. And I was like, God damn it, Pop was right. He's right through and through. His critical thought on the matter and his instincts were correct. And I've held to that ever since. That I agree with you. I do agree with you that he was a lone shooter. It's not conspiracy theory. It's a sad, unfortunate event. Just like, if you go back and you read the events that led to World War I, talk about some absolute weird circumstances that actually led to Duke Ferdinand actually getting shot. When you understand how the whole thing was a bust, the guy's sitting on the curb eating a sandwich, and he pulls up. You know what I mean? These moments in history are scary, weird. A lot of times these just stupid coincidence. Look at how the attempted assassinations on Hitler didn't work.
Yes.
You know what I mean? No one accounted
crowd
for.
Who can't set off a bomb at the right time is.
Well, the thing is he did set it off at the right time. What they didn't account for was how heavy the goddamn table was.
Right.
That table was a slab of wood, and it could just eat a ton of kinetic energy.
Yeah.
Because wood has an amazing property, having been being biomaterial, of being extremely absorbent.
Yes.
So
it's much more resilient than rock.
Yeah, it's a great buffer in that. So when you set
that's why Kevlar is somewhat softer than you would think it would be.
Yeah. So it's just these odd things, and especially especially considering the detail orientation of a German officer, you would think all of the computations and all the numbers and physics of it would have been worked out, so they would have accounted for the ballistic absorbent nature of the wood table that Hitler was at. But I also think it was also slightly off where it was supposed to be placed and things like that. But that bomb went off pretty much right underneath the table he was standing at the right time. But again, he didn't die.
Right.
I look back on that. I always do. Every time I hear conspiracy theories about it, I'm like, no, he was a lone shooter. And I haven't had the chance. I've been to Texas a couple times, but I haven't been to Dallas. But I am going to make it a point to get to Dallas and to get to Dealey Plaza, because from what I understand, it's not big. It's a fairly small space when you're there. And when you stand there on the ground and you look where the book suppository is, supposedly that plaza itself, because it is fairly small, but acoustically you can hear almost everything. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of echo. You can kind of hear casual conversations from a good distance because of the echo and because of the acoustic echoing in that area. So it's not really that large. And I agree with I'm convinced.
Well, I never tried to sell to it.
Yeah, I know.
Now, I need to ask you a question which goes back to something you said earlier.
Okay.
And I have to chuckle a little bit.
Okay.
But you said at the time you were deployed from Okinawa for a second time.
Mm-hmm.
You were salty in the core.
Yeah.
What on earth? How can a kid who's only been in less than 4 years be considered salty?
Okay, so
I would figure you got a lot of hash stripes on your arm before you pick up any salt.
No, I kind of said it tongue in cheek, although at the time, you know, when you're on your second deployment, and it was a very different time then. But if when you're new to the fleet, or I should say when you were new to the fleet and you hadn't been on a deployment, you were the term we called was a boot.
Fair enough.
You were a boot, meaning straight out of boot camp and you didn't know jack shit.
Right.
You know, boot was much more common than like FNG. FNG still around, but it was more residual from the Vietnam area. Fucking new guy. So boot was a shorter, quicker acronym for someone who didn't really fucking know anything and hadn't deployed. So, and at that time, going on deployment was kind of a hallmark.
Okay.
In your time in the fleet. And I can only speak to the fleet as a young Marine stationed with 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines in Hawaii. I can't – there are similarities, I'm sure. I've met Marines who were in around the same time who were at Pendleton or who were at Lejeune, but they were they did have different experiences. So I'm guessing that there was a different subculture. You didn't have the internet. We were much more in isolation then.
Right.
There were truly kind of, you know, every place you went to was its own kind of subculture within the larger culture of the Corps, and you could go down to a different level. So as an infantryman, as an 18 or 19-year-old kid, you were a boot.
Fair enough.
If you went on your first deployment, after your first deployment, you were on your first deployment, you were still a boot. The guys who had been on first deployment and were on their second deployment, in relation to you, they were assault. So they were salty.
All right. Okay.
They had been deployed, so they had some sea salt on them.
Okay.
It's a throwback term to someone who had
Fair
been
enough.
on. And we didn't go on ships.
Right.
From where I deployed from, we didn't go on ships, but our equivalent of a deployment versus a Westpac or a Medfloat was our deployment to Okinawa. Now, interestingly enough, at the time that I was in, when I was in 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, and this changed right after I left, the Corps was doing some restructuring in its deployment schedules. My regiment, 3rd Marine Regiment, which technically was headquartered in Okinawa, still is, but the bulk of the regiment were stationed in Hawaii.
Okay.
I should say the division was stationed in Okinawa. The regiment was stationed in Hawaii.
Okay.
So we always had 2 battalions in Hawaii, and 1 battalion was deployed to Okinawa. But the interesting thing was, when you were deployed, you were technically in the divisional home.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So our rotation schedule was within 18 months, you would do an entire workup, deploy, and then return home. So the deployment cycle for Marines in 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, or 3rd Marines, technically 3rd Marine Regiment, so you can be in 1-3-2-3 or 3-3. I was in 3rd 3-3. You would go through an entire cycle in 18 months.
Okay.
The rest of the Corps at the time was doing 7 to 9 month deployments. So their workup was still the same, was actually longer. So because you would have 2 sister battalions that would have 9-month deployments,
right,
you would have 18 months in between your deployments. So you would actually have about a 27-month cycle, whereas we would only have an 18-month cycle. So we were the highest tempo regiment as far as deployment cycles go in the Marine Corps at the time. So that's where – so by the time I came to my second deployment, I was a quote-unquote salt at the time.
Okay.
I was a salty – and I mean the funny thing is I had my salty ego put in check between my two deployments when I ended up going, it's called being FAP'd. It's a fleet assistance program. I don't even know if it still exists, but it's an acronym within the Corps at the time. So I came back from my first deployment, and one of the corporals in my platoon said, "Hey, Ralph, do you want to learn how to be a machine gunner?" And I was like, "Sure," because you kind of do an internal shuffling of your companies when you come back off deployments.
Okay.
And I was like, "Sure." So I ended up going to weapons platoon, and I ended up going to the machine gun section. So I cross-trained as an 0331, which is a machine gunner. And then from there, I ended up going and working up at the Regimental 3 shop. So I went from being a lance corporal who had been a team leader and a saw gunner in a rifle platoon to a gunner in a weapons platoon within the same company. And then within a couple days, I was working at a Regimental S3 shop.
Okay.
And when I got to that Regimental S3 shop, I was the junior guy,
right,
by just shy of an entire 4-year contract.
Okay.
So I was going from walking around chest pulled out, I'm a salty devil dog, to a fucking boot in real short order. And I think that the two guys who I went up there with 3 guys. I went up there with 3 guys from my battalion who were all corporals, and they were all 6-year contract Marines.
Okay.
And they were all in their 5th year of their contract. So
right.
I was junior by 3 years for them. Mm-hmm. And then the next person after that had 8 years in the Corps. So
okay.
So I was like super low man on the totem pole. My only saving grace was that I was a very motivated go-getter through and through infantry type Marine, and not everybody up at regiment at that level. There was not a lot of 0311s or riflemen's. Because at that level of a headquarters, there's a lot more of your technical expertise available. So what I lacked in rank, I carried in respect because of my MOS, and that carried a lot of weight.
Oh, good.
So even within the 3 shop, there was only a handful of 03s, which is the infantry designator.
Okay.
So although I wasn't salty in my years in the Corps, I had been a tip of the spear Marine, and I had deployed, so I at least was not a complete newbie boot. I also was lucky enough to have a staff sergeant who looked at my ASVAB scores and realized that I actually had some anomalous high scores in areas like clerical abilities and stuff like that. So I was actually pretty good at doing the office work, and because of that, he took advantage of it, and I kind of earned a reputation for being a very, very good at even working at that level, even though I was junior by a long shot. So, but it was a rough ride in other ways. It was a formative experience to work at such a high level headquarters. What I thought then was a high level headquarters. Lo and behold, now that's kind of where I work, and I'm used to it. At a brigade level, which is the Army equivalent.
Yeah, but you've got your railroad tracks. You're not.
Yeah, so I'm a different animal now.
Yes.
But yeah, so I mean that's where the term salty came from.
Okay.
That it's quasi tongue in cheek, but depending on where you put me in the Corps at that time, if I'm at a rifle platoon, I have a deployment. We get a bunch of boots in who've never deployed.
Right.
Now they're boots, and I'm a salt.
Right.
You take me and throw me up at a regiment, I've got a long way to go before I'm no longer a fucking boot. So, but then I went back down to my battalion and went on my second deployment. And at that time I was, 2 deployments, coming up on the end of your contract. You're legitimate salt. You're not like chesty puller, crusty salty, but I mean, you're legitimate. You're a legit Marine. Okay. At that point, in that time in the Corps. Yeah. It's funny you picked up on that and asked that, because I don't know if I've kind of given even that kind of a synopsis or a summary of my time in the Marine Corps to anyone in a long time, because I really don't talk about it much. Yeah, because most people don't have the the vernacular to make it a fairly short conversation. I have discovered that having discussions about my military career, although people often, going back to that conspiracy theory line, people think they think it's avoidance because, oh, you must know stuff. And actually, no, it's actually more like a conversational laziness. It's easier to talk military when you can speak in acronyms. And you can go with a lot of assumed understanding. So I can say a brigade, a platoon, a battalion. Like I can jump around in all these different organizational structures.
Right.
And because of your experience in the military and your being around it and being knowledgeable of it, can all of a sudden you don't have to ask about those things.
Right.
But someone who's never served, they're like, wait, what's this? Wait, what's this?
Yeah.
And it just becomes horribly disruptive.
Yeah.
And a 10 to 15 minute explanation of something turns into hours. In rabbit holes that cannot be discussed, and you can never get the point of it across. But wow, okay, I didn't expect that. Thanks, Pop.
It's all right, no sweat.
Had you heard the term salty? I take it you had heard it before.
Well, the term salt, I had only heard in terms of real deep water sailors. Okay,
like Uncle Pete.
Uncle Pete.
Well, I'm saying that because he was a shellback, wasn't he? Or did he never enter the shellback order like Grandpa Connor did?
I do not know. All I know is I regret deeply my loss of some of his letters because I lost his letters. And in one of them, he described an experience as a corpsman. He never went on board. He was on a hospital ship standing off Korea taking care of wounded Marines.
Yeah.
Who I'm sure there were other people, but I think mainly being in the Navy and being on a hospital ship, there may have been Army passing through, but I don't know. But some of them were heartbreaking and very moving, and it made him a pacifist. Even though sometimes you must resort to arms to do what needs to be done, and it's a terrible, necessary thing.
Yeah, there's actually I heard you would find this interesting. I don't know if you know who Sam Harris is. You might not. Anyways, he's a contemporary, very smart, very well thought. He's a neuroscientist by training, but he is more of a philosopher, and he likes to kind of ponder social contemporary American problems and stuff like that. But he does a lot of digital media and stuff like that, a lot of podcast interviews and podcasting on his own. But he actually laid out this really interesting argument, and it's really eloquent and very sound, where pacifism is immoral. And I'm not going to kind of get into it, but it's interesting, and we can talk about it another time. But it's really kind of interesting because I never heard it laid out in the way he does. And when he lays it out, I'm like, okay, that's a very solid, strong argument. And I find he kind of, for me, hearing him lay it out like that, it put to bed why I had always kind of had this like gnawing in the back of my brain where it didn't seem right. I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't quite put my finger on why. And then I hear him lay it out, and I'm like, that's it. There it is. So it's interesting.
Well, the only two corpsmen I know, one is a writer named Doug Anderson, who ran writing groups that your mom attended for a long time. Mm-hmm. He was a corpsman in Nam. My brother Pete was a corpsman during Korea.
Yep.
Both of them, having seen what they have seen and lived what they have lived, are both pacifists. I'm not going to discuss right now because it's inadequate preparation for it.
Yeah.
Anything, but I know when they stand to the side and they're taking care of wounded troops, I know they both are pacifists.
Yeah.
I knew one medic in the Army, and I don't know, he was from Korea. I don't know how he acquired it, but I'm damn sure he earned it. But all he would ever say about his silver star, this is for a medic. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Whoa.
All I wanted to do was go home.
Yeah.
Now, he was still in the military by choice.
That's fucking
How
powerful.
a medic picks up a silver star, there may be ways to do it, but
You've got to be in some horrible shit, and you've got to put your fucking ass out there for it.
okay, the only thing I can think is that when a medic picks up a silver star, it's virtually a CMH, a congressional medal, because they're not allowed to shoot back.
Yeah, but the way that they're written, because it's an act of valor, that can be. I hate to say this, but there is something to be said in the awarding of a medal, because the process for the level of the medal has to be signed off at higher levels, right? So there's a magnitude kind of component to it. So what would be interesting is to know what if it was downgraded to a silver star. If it actually in the write-up it wasn't actually submitted at a higher level, because it goes to a higher level, and depending on the narrative and how well it's written, if if it gets approved at this, and this, and then it gets all the way back to say the Pentagon, and I'm just saying theoretically, gets back to the Pentagon, and now someone who's a staff officer like Grandpa Ralph, for instance, or even more far removed than Grandpa Ralph, who'd never been that close to a battlefield. And a lot of that is it's not a judgment call on them. So a lot of that's just circumstance. It's timing, right?
Yeah.
One could argue that Colin Powell is, part of it is who he is, but then there's also these points along his career that even he admits was just the right place, the right time. So that person is there, and when they read the narrative, are they like, when they look at what constitutes the litmus test to being awarded this medal, and based upon the other ones that they've seen, okay, do we give them this medal? And that's where you see you don't see a consistency across wars when it comes to the awarding of the Congressional Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor has these peaks and valleys depending on the conflict, depending on. So I'm sure there were hundreds, if not thousands, of incidents on Omaha Beach that warranted a Congressional Medal of Honor. I can't in my mind fathom that there weren't. The thing is, the observers of it probably died. The people who have written the medal probably died. And there are more ways than I can count to display valor, to conduct oneself in such a courageous and honorable way to warrant the term valor that does not involve killing the enemy. And this statement that all I wanted to do was come home tells me that possibly he must have. For a medic, he must have picked up a weapon. There must have been some threat either to his life, because there are instances. Medics do carry 45s.
I did not know that.
Yeah, they do carry sidearms. They're allowed to carry sidearms, and they're allowed to use their firearm or even pick up another firearm in the defense of those in their care.
Okay.
The only person in the military service who does not carry a weapon under any circumstance is a chaplain.
Okay.
But they have a chaplain's assistant whose sole charge is to defend them.
Okay.
And a chaplain's assistant's job is not to just assist the chaplain, but in the most dire circumstances, so in Omaha Beach or D-Day or the invasion of Sicily or any of these, is to be right by the chaplain's side, providing covering fire and being a shield for the chaplain. So there are circumstances under which I could see a medic or a corpsman using a firearm and killing the enemy. But what I was getting at is that there is plenty of circumstances, at least in my eyes, and I would use that as a critical filter when looking at submission of nominations for award, to where a medic could warrant getting a Silver Star or higher. We'll say that wouldn't involve killing. It could simply be in the act of saving those lives for those who they're in charge of, and that takes a lot of fucking balls to do that. I think to run out into, and I'm not saying this is the case, but theoretically, to run out into overwhelming fields of fire to retrieve wounded and possibly dead without any hesitation and possibly multiple times, yeah, that takes just as much fucking balls as storming a machine gun nest.
Okay, I want to ask you another question. I'm looking for definitions here. I realize this is a personal question for me.
Okay.
And it's one I hear a lot on the radio, but I'll ask the question this way.
Okay.
By making a statement first. In my mind, okay, I hear the term decorated veteran a lot. But to me, personally, I've got a soldier's medal, a Defense of Europe medal, I've got a good conduct medal. I do not consider myself decorated, because the base word for decorated is decor, which is how you behave. How decorously have you behaved? To me, a decoration is something you get for an act of valor, as opposed to a medal, of which I've got 3 medals, but they're ridiculous. I mean, everybody who's even signed up and raised his right hand is entitled to 3 medals instantly, or 2. So that, to me, is not decoration. Now, I don't know, how is that defined in your mind, even if you don't have a dictionary definition? To me, a decoration is something you got because you were exhibited valor.
I would say,
therefore, you have been decorated because of your decorum under pressure and danger.
In my mind,
in
my mind, and again, I'm glad you said in my mind, because if you were going to say in the context in which you've heard it, I would say poorly. That's my own feeling, though. I feel that all right. So you said you've heard it a lot in recent years, and I'm guessing you mean in reference to it.
Some poor slob goes kill somebody. You find out he's a decorated veteran.
So decorated veteran.
Why?
Or someone is on a news show as a talking head and they're referred to as a decorated veteran. Or, I mean, there's all kinds of ways it kind of gets thrown around, right?
Yes.
I think it's thrown around rather loosely. But I think since 9/11, which we're going to get to in a second, I think since 9/11, the term hero has been used rather loosely in a within our vernacular. I think the term, and I don't think it's done purposefully. I think it is done with the intention is irreverence, but I think it comes from a place of ignorance of what, in my opinion, what really constitutes heroism. Or what it takes to actually get to the level of being heroic. So early on, about over an hour ago now, we discussed both Smedley Butler and Audie Murphy, and if you know their stories, you especially Audie Murphy, you know that just because someone is heroic in a moment in time or in several. Because to say Audie Murphy was not a heroic guy is pure fucking ignorance. But it doesn't mean that someone is an angel.
Understood.
And I think many people don't know that about Audie Murphy and I didn't really know about Audie Murphy as much until I came in the Army. And he's of revered status, rightly so, deservingly so, within the Army. But it's almost a whitewash in that reverence. Having Audie Murphy clubs and holding him up. And it's funny, he's highly revered in the NCO Corps. And I always jokingly, but as a kind of an ego check, remind people that he earned his Congressional Medal of Honor as a commissioned officer.
So you mentioned to me, yes.
So I like to kind of point that out, that his highest decoration, of which he is the most the most decorated soldier in the Army's history. I do like to point that out, but that's intra-service banter within the Army and between NCOs and officers, which is always ribbing. But the term hero has been horribly hijacked, I think, and I think you also see that playing out in the rather casual usage of the term highly decorated.
Oh, just decorated.
So yeah, okay, well, decorated. Well, because you could say, well, so someone might say highly decorated, meaning in just number.
Right.
Not necessarily understanding that highly decorated should actually mean in stack of merit. Like
okay.
where it falls. So a Medal of Honor is the highest decoration. And you have cross. You have Silver Star. You have Bronze Star with a Bronze Star, Bronze Star with a V. You have an Archon with a V. I mean, there's this descending order or ascending, depending on where you start. Which to me, that actually is when I get into it. And you ask that's why I'm glad you said my. So for me, the term decorated probably. To me, decorated translates or is reflective of acknowledged by witness or witnesses, an act that does, by definition, constitute a degree of heroism. So. Okay. I would say the circumstances have to be so that it would rate a V device or higher.
Okay, fair enough. That would be my own attitude toward that.
That would be mine, and I don't impress that upon anyone. I don't hold anyone else to that. I have. You can have a fairly competent rack or stack, which is your awards and medals. The military does a great job of at least giving a summary resume on your chest.
Yes.
I don't think that necessarily having a good rack means you are, in my opinion, highly decorated. The longer you stay in, the more colorful fabric you acquire.
Yes.
I think that is often confused. And I also think that it's often taken advantage of by those who are in the know, and they kind of hoodwink those who aren't in the know.
Fair enough.
So I think, and I don't know why this is, it might have to do with, I have like a lot of theories of underlying currents of when you get into entitlement and stuff like that, that's kind of become more prevalent in our society, at least I believe. So if you're in the military now, and it's a small percentage of people who serve, those who aren't in the military aren't allowed to criticize you.
Say again that last
So those who have not served
Okay.
There's a reluctance or a reservation about criticizing those who have served. So if you're a vet, you're a subject matter expert. And there's all kinds of things that get wrapped up into it. They don't understand that, and I'm not knocking it, but this is where like the young Marine in me comes out. One of my points of contention, and people who I know in the military hear this are going to laugh because I always say this, but I will always be at the heart of it an 0311, an infantryman in the Marine Corps. That will always be the first lens that I look through. So from that lens, there is only one combat arm. Of the combat arms, it's a misnomer.
You've said this to me before. I understand that.
The infantry is the only combat arms. And to be more specific, the rifleman is the only infantryman in the military. If you are not an infantryman, you are support. And
I understand the concept, but I've known guys who were able to help their outfits bust out because they were in tanks.
Sure, and I'm not saying
Korea.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, you're in a tank, so you are in support of.
Fair enough. I'll buy that.
And you are in an armored animal with an armored vehicle with a very large caliber weapon
and a machine gun.
Well, I was actually going to say the very large caliber weapon. The machine gun is actually your smaller gun.
Yes, I know that.
So these are luxuries that the rifleman, the dog soldier, that dirty, cold, tired, been walking forever grunt does not have the luxury of.
Understood.
So my definition is admittedly colored by my experience, and my experience informs my opinion and my view.
Fair enough.
There are plenty of people who I serve with and who I have a ton of respect for who disagree with my position as far as the rifleman is the only combat arms and everybody else is support. And they would probably, because that's my starting point though, that's where I view and differentiate what a decorated person comes from. It is from that lens of the Lance Corporal in the Marine Corps, in a rifle platoon, in a squad, in a team, that I say, if you want to be considered decorated, you are going to have to be a victim of circumstance. You're going to have to be in the wrong place at the right time and do the right thing to become decorated. And that's chance. Until that moment comes, you will never know. You might believe, everyone could believe, but you will never know. You don't get an Audie Murphy unless the conditions are absolutely wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I truly mean that.
Fair enough.
It has to be the right person in the wrong place at the wrong time to rise to that occasion. Audie Murphy was that person.
Yeah.
But he wasn't necessarily in whether or not it was the circumstances that later haunted him and made him not such a good civilian, not such a good person in a civil sense. In a domestic sense, he wasn't the best person. He was a drunk. He was a mean drunk. He was abusive. I don't know if that template was there, because then you find other people who are Congressional Medal of Honor winners who go through different circumstances and they become humble and they become pacifists. I mean, who knows?
Okay,
but they're no less heroic.
I'm going to cut into this very briefly. When I first got to my first outfit, which was an artillery unit in the last days of the 90 millimeter gun, there was a guy who had earned what was then called the Soldier's Medal. It was the highest peacetime decoration you could get for heroism. He'd gone in deliberately to a burning building, got a buddy out under terrible circumstances, saved his life. He was awarded the Soldier's Medal, but there was a problem. He was a drinker. He was a behavioral problem.
Yeah.
But they were reluctant to let him go because, and I'm using this phrase carefully now, he had been decorated for the best of reasons under the circumstances, and they were very reluctant to let him go.
Yeah.
But he was, this is why I asked the question, what does decorated mean to you? To me, it's someone whose decorum is doing the right thing at the wrong time.
Yeah.
And it takes valor to do that.
I think sometimes I think it's lost on people and even the organizations themselves that quite often the people who rise to the occasion when it comes to break glass in case of war are able to do that because they're not necessarily the best people to be around when there's not a war going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think that's something that's very hard for us to grapple with. I think there's a pretty sad state of affairs with not veterans care, because I'm not going to go down that road, but veterans have always had, although it has gotten better, a tough time returning home. And those who are really good at the craft of killing have a harder time. A lot of the times, it's kind of a fairly broad statement, but sometimes their struggle to adjust is fairly silent, and in all outward appearances, they do a pretty good job of adjusting, but there's always that echo of the sound of battle, and for whatever reason, it'll for those who it does, it speaks to your soul, and I don't know. You remember when this is going to sound like a weird analogy, but it's the best one I can come up with. Do you remember when we used to let cider into the backyard in early winter? And if you let him out back when it was a cool, crisp morning, that would tell you winter was coming, his demeanor would change.
Yes. And
he would stop. And he would raise his neck like that iconic picture of a wolf howling against the full moon. And he would just sniff the air. And if you just watched him and observed him, you could see that cold air speaking to something that was primal inside him and of his DNA that came from his breeding of the Chuck cheese and all of that. Like you could see that in him. I think that picture for me, because most people are never going to see that in a husky, but when you do, that for me, there are times, there are noises, there are sounds that pull me back in the sense that I saw him getting pulled back by his DNA. And so for me, I have a foundation that led me to a path that led me to experiences that therefore informs my opinion, which is what you asked for.
Yes.
So, that's a really long, drawn-out thing, but it's also something that I think I can't answer that question simply.
It doesn't admit of a simple answer.
Yeah, and I think also probably I feel like it warrants a longer answer just because of the oversimplification and probably the misunderstanding and rather liberal usage of the term hero and decorated or highly decorated and things like that. So I feel a need to kind of caveat that a lot. So we're kind of running on here, and I before we wrap or here as we wrap, I kind of want to fast forward in your life and in the time of our country and all that. So, but that's all good information as far as informing your life as a younger man, what happened in our nation, which was kind of formative for you. Fast forward to September 11th, 2001. We'll say 11 o'clock.
Okay, let's go a little earlier than that.
Okay.
I don't know the exact time. The phone rings.
Yep.
It's a beautiful day. It's Aunt Trudy calling. The radio's on in the background.
NPR?
NPR.
As always.
Is there any other? It's however the time of the news, so I know that it wasn't when music would begin. It was earlier in the morning.
Okay.
Probably around 9 or thereabouts. She's talking to me. I hear a voice on the radio say, an airplane has crashed into the World Trade Center. And I pulled back mentally. I didn't hang up on Trudy. I just kept on talking to her. But I thought, what the heavens going on here? I was thinking something else, but I'll use that phrase. What's going on here? Who could possibly have made a mistake like that?
Yeah, how do you fly into the freaking World Trade Center?
Okay. Now.
Accidentally.
Yeah. But at that time, that's all anybody knew.
Of course. Sure.
The first plane only had hit. The second plane was to come a bit later. Pennsylvania and the Pentagon would come later. But we didn't know anything at that point. I didn't stop talking to Aunt Trudy. I didn't try to get her off the phone saying, hey, something's serious going on here. She didn't know what was going on at all. Okay. Stop right there.
Mm-hmm.
Then we jump forward. Later in the morning, I think you're living over in Springfield.
It was Stockbridge Courts.
Okay, fair enough. I am sitting there thinking, how did those buildings collapse? I'm as cold as a reptile. How do those buildings collapse? You call up. You have a better grip on what's going on. This is still happening.
Uh-huh.
You are crying. You're a combat veteran. You're crying.
Well, I wasn't a combat vet at that point.
Fair enough. But
Yeah.
you were of a warrior
I was a
mind.
veteran, yeah.
Okay. And you're saying, my God, there's people dying. You're on the edge of weeping.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I'm just trying to figure out how they made those buildings, how the buildings collapsed. Were they pre-charged so they'd collapse?
Oh,
You're thinking about the human loss, and I am thinking technicalities.
Yeah.
This is nuts.
Yeah.
I'm telling you now, this is nuts on my part. Yours was the correct reaction.
Hmm.
The skies go quiet.
Yeah.
We find out what's happened. Normally, our area is, West Springfield, is a very heavy air activity region.
Oh, yeah, this whole area.
Because we got Westover, we got Barnes, we got Brainerd, which is an itty-bitty airport in the Hartford area, and, of course, there's Bradley.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on which way the wind is coming, so the aircraft got to make their final approaches from here, there, or wherever. A lot of aircraft, and it's as silent as can be. I'm walking the dog and looking at that empty blue sky and knowing what's going on down in the city. And I start barely to come to grips with what's going on when you came to grips with it immediately, because I think, seriously, you're a more compassionate person than I am.
I don't know if that's true.
I don't know if it's true or not, but that was the sense I had then and the sense I have even now. Yours was the right reaction. People are dying. This is a horrible thing. I'm thinking, how the hell did they charge that building? That night, watching TV, I hear this guy who was a metallurgical genius explaining why the towers collapsed.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do with pre-charging the damn building.
Yeah. I think probably it has less to do. I think, so it's interesting you say that. I think it probably had less to do with compassion and more to do with, I think I had a better sense, and actually it goes back to that recall in 97. I think when I got out of the Marine Corps, having served in the Marine Corps in 94 to 98, which was a period of time, a unique period of time, a really strange period of time, especially now, historically speaking, where there was this consensus or this idea that the world was a fairly safe place, or at least it was becoming more safe.
Yes.
And I think for a lot of people, and that's not to say you fell into that category, but I think you to a degree more so than I did, because I had been out in the world and I had been part of an organization and been kind of read on, so to speak, about how many threats really still did exist in this world. And were kind of the things going bump in the night, but most people weren't hearing them. When it happened and when the second plane hit, I immediately knew it was terrorism. So I didn't need to hear speculation from a talking head. I knew we were under attack. But I also knew that we were under attack and the people being attacked were civilians.
Yep.
And that's what bothered me so much. That's what bothered me so much. I think your reaction was more a reaction of shock. And I think your reaction is actually something that's probably more common. I think a lot of people were like, whoa, how the hell? What the hell? And a lot of people to this day are still doing the how the hell could those buildings come down? It couldn't happen. Controlled charge, that whole loose change, and the conspiracy theorist things, which I think is absolutely deplorable. The only thing I think that's more deplorable than the conspiracy theorists that surround 9/11 are the ones that surround like Sandy Hook and these tragedies of these school shootings where these little children die, and people want to conspiracy theorists and call it false flag operations, like a lot of the ones about 9/11. But yeah, for me, I knew, and it wasn't just sad. I was angry. I was so mad.
And that was a healthier reaction than mine.
But I was mad in a sense that I felt like we had failed. I had always felt that so long as no one attacked us, meaning collectively as a nation, that it was the military is a unique animal, especially the way we're constructed. So I don't think people understand Department of the Defense has some really heavy meaning to it. Besides, it's different to be a Department of Defense versus being the War Department.
Amen.
And my job as a young Marine, if I was doing it well, I was within my tradecraft, I was unemployed. I wasn't fighting a war.
Right.
I was so good at posturing, and we as a nation were so good at posturing that no one wanted to move past that stage of human behavior. They didn't actually want to cross that threshold, which you don't see in a lot. I mean, we can go into primate behavioralism at another time, but it's a fairly unique thing. A lot of animals in nature posture but never actually act on violence.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that.
So I had always felt in a animal behavioral sense that if I was doing my job well, and we collectively as the military were doing our job well, we would be out of a job. It is only when we failed to do our job, and this is a real huge simplification, but it's still it's at the heart of it what mattered and kind of fed that reaction. I was angry, but I was sad because I felt like part of me, and although I was 3 years out of the Corps at this time, as far as my active duty time contractual commitment, I felt as though I had failed and we had failed. And we had failed the citizens who relied upon us to stand on that wall and to provide that blanket of freedom. And that failure cost greatly. And that hurt. To this day it does. And there's a lot of complexity to it, and there's layers and layers to it, but in a real simple level, that's what was coming out. And when the initial reports came out about the Pentagon being hit, the initial reports were that it was Camp David.
I remember that.
And I was at you guys' house when that report came out, and that broke my heart because Camp David is guarded by Marines. And there's a Marine detail there. And that was extremely close to home at the time. The only military I knew at that time was the Marine Corps.
Right.
And the only Marine Corps I knew was Marine Corps Infantry. So I was internally, psychologically, and emotionally, I was a very different veteran then than I am now by a number of measures. But that potential, the idea that Marines who I could very intimately identify with would die in such a so far removed from the field of battle. It sounds weird, but in a warrior culture, in such a way that would rob you of Valhalla, was just fucking heartbreaking to me.
I believe that.
And the only thing I could probably equate it to is how Marines must have felt when the Marine barracks in Beirut were bombed.
Yep.
If anyone knows, that's another thing within like veterans groups and stuff like that. People, it's not an uncommon tagline until we meet in Valhalla.
Okay.
But people say that, and I don't think they understand that there was a litmus test for getting to Valhalla. You had to die honorably on the field of battle,
yes,
courageously. I mean,
yes.
that's why Vikings, like the whole berserker idea and just going down swinging and taking as many with you and being fearless was a part of it. It was entrenched in the culture, and so we say this until Valhalla, but few people die in a manner that warrants entry to Valhalla in modern battle. And to me, to be robbed of that as a warrior is fucked. And I felt that at the time. So I think there was a lot of that was in that. So it was less compassion and more anger. And
still a healthier reaction than mine.
Possibly. I don't think
I'm not faulting myself for it. I'm just dazzled by the difference.
Well, you were also 63 at the time, correct?
Somewhere in there, yeah.
Yeah, you were 63 and I was 23, 24.
Somewhere in there, yeah.
Yeah, so, 23. No, 25. I was 25.
Okay.
25 at the time, you were 63. I think there's going to be a difference. And considering the span of American history and the stuff you saw, there's different things that formed who you were. I think fundamentally, we're actually very similar in our probably personality type and stuff like that. So our level of compassion is probably fairly similar. But our life experiences are what make us different animals in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. But, it's interesting that you do clearly remember. That's how you remember 9/11. Do you remember how angry I was after 9/11 though? At people's the patriotism, the displays of patriotism.
Well, I remember, and we do need to wrap it soon.
Yeah, that's fine.
Unfortunately, I do remember your admiration of my black T-shirt with the eagle on it just recently.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Okay. Well, I bought that shirt just because I thought it was nifty. I wasn't necessarily concerned about the red, white, and blue blood running through my veins at the time.
Yeah.
I have two of them, actually, because I forgot I bought the first one when I bought the second one. But no, I see, let's put it this way, mostly it's pickup trucks being driven by guys I can't see, and it's usually guys. And there's these enormous flags.
Yeah.
Big enough to be seen.
To be flown off a battleship.
Yeah, but only on a state occasion. And I'm just curious, has this guy ever pulled the duty? By that I mean served in the military at all.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases they have. Or I believe they have.
Well, it's not like the truck we saw today.
Oh, yeah.
No. This is plain, ordinary pickup trucks, and it's got this flag that probably costs it 5 miles a gallon.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, hey, have you pulled the duty?
Yeah.
And I don't even ask them wouldn't think of asking if they're combat. Have you ever put on the uniform? Now, given the fact that in this day and age, rather than 40 or 30 or 10% whatever the number was back when I was a kid, when you just about had to, it's 2%. At least that's the official number I've heard.
Yeah.
So if they're young, I wonder.
Yeah. Well, that's
all.
That's a valid pondering.
But that's all I can do is ponder.
Do you? I mean, obviously it did, but change America. Do you think the memory of it in today's accelerated culture and accelerated world, and what I mean by that is information technology, everything has become much more rapid. Do you think that just the pace of life is faster? Do you think the significance of 9/11 15 years later is as present or as well remembered as Pearl Harbor was 15 years post Pearl Harbor? Because it was a pretty crazy 15 years after Pearl Harbor.
That's one I cannot answer. Let me say it this way, because experience matters a lot here.
Yep.
Your nephew is turning 19 tomorrow.
Yep.
His birthday, he was 4 years old that day of 9/11.
Yep.
Okay. I don't know how that's formed his life. It's something I've never asked him. Let's put it this way. Your Aunt Maureen was born on December 7th, but not of 1941.
Yeah.
Okay? But I try not to pull up these parallels with people whose birthdays happen to be most unfortunate. Not their fault. They were born when they were born, and the horrors happened before or after they were born. I remember one of my birthdays as a birthday when it was announced by the Kremlin that Joseph Stalin had died.
Oh, wow.
And that was, when I heard about it, was March 4th, my birthday. I was living in Vermont. It was a damn cold day. I think I'd been genuinely ill, probably with one of my bouts of pneumonia. And this is a harsh, cruel thing to say, but I knew enough about Stalin to consider that a birthday present.
Yeah. Something to rejoice.
Yeah, well, and given the fact that I am not a perfect human being, despite the vast disparity of his wrongdoing and mine, I never forget that I ain't perfect either, and I don't know what I would have done if I'd been in his circumstances back then.
Mm-hmm.
Would I have gone as nuts as he did, but still be as capable and manipulative a person as he was to rise to the top of Russia, which was at least as cutthroat as Nazi Germany?
Oh, yeah.
So I still think it was well he was removed from the world. It's just unfortunate he wasn't removed before he became who he became.
Yeah.
The same can be said of Adolf Hitler. But I do remember hearing a story on the radio today where Gander, Newfoundland took in thousands of people the day after 9/11 because they were all grounded at Gander. They couldn't fly into the States. And how well Gander took care of them even though they didn't have the resources. And they're still fondly remembered today, 15 years later, as they were welcomed 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And scholarships were set up for the children of those little towns that took all these wandering strangers in.
Wow.
And so you have, there's a theological proposition that the devil may do evil, but God finds a way to take good back out of it. And I'd rather the evil didn't happen, but I'm grateful for those who can find this and turn something like that into the best they have at hand.
Interesting.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
and I'm about wrung out of ideas, big guy.
Okay.
I really am.
All right, Pop. Well, I really appreciate you sitting down with me.
I am honored.
No, it was really, really a pleasure and very actually enlightening in a lot of ways. I have always said, or for a long time anyways, I have said that there are not a lot of people in this world. Matter of fact, I could probably count them on one hand. People who I feel are similar to me, or in a lot of ways, and just who grok me. And you're one of those people, and I am very grateful for the relationship that we have, and I, not just because biologically and genetically I'm inclined to love you. I love you very much, but I am always have been and always will be supremely grateful to whatever the powers may be that you're my father, and that we've had and have the relationship that we have. And I'm really, really, really glad we had this chance to sit down and talk like this about these things, because now I'm really going to cherish this. So thank you.
Well, you're very welcome, but I want to say one thing about this. I'm grateful to you, because one of the things that was, I think it's the way both my mother and father were raised, and that is they were very much silent about their own growing up and some of the high and low points of their lives. And I'm honored and grateful that you've asked me to share some of my life with you in a way that I never had the opportunity to share with my mother or father, and not because they were clams, but they just, I think a direct question would have given me a direct, indirect answer, a dance around, and I don't get this. I don't get any sense of hesitancy to talk to you about some things. Some things you'll never hear from me, but you shouldn't anyway, because you're my child.
But vice versa.
Yeah. And when my mother found out some things about the three of us growing up together before Indy arrived, she was horrified to see what twerps we had been. And the way we'd been twerps, and better, I don't know what kind of twerp you may have been at times in your life.
Yeah.
We all go through that. That's okay. But thank you for the opportunity to share with you. We both learned something about one another, and that's wonderful.
Thanks, Pop.
Thank you, my son.
Love
God
you.
bless. And I will say my final fatherly closings that I should always use with you. A, do not interrupt me. A, keep your powder dry. And B, keep your bowstring waxed.
Thanks, Pop. I love
I'm
you.
sorry you have to, but you damn well better.
I will, Pop. Thanks.
Okay. You're more
Love
than
you.
welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye, Pop. Thanks. That's the interview with my father, William Ralph. Can't believe it's 9/11. Can't believe it's been 15 years. Yeah, 9/11 profoundly changed my life, and I believe probably all of yours. I hope you enjoyed the interview with my father. I hope you found it fascinating, and I hope it makes you ponder the significance of our lives. Take Take care. Thanks, everybody.